Is that the live file?
Hello.
Hello.
You weren't watching the countdown, were you? I like to surprise Nirmal with, oh, we're live.
Yeah, there we go.
Hello, I'm Bret.
Hey, I'm Nirmal. Nice
we
to
are
meet you all
both
today.
we are both Docker captains, and we are both live on the internet right now. So we work in cloud native. I work for myself. He works for AWS, and we're doing this thing on the show. We're answering your questions. That's why we're here.
Yep.
In case they don't know, maybe we should tell them, hey, did you all know that this is a podcast? This turns into a podcast. Our great editor, Christy, actually goes through.
No way. When does it become
lean
a podcast?
In. Let's lean in. It turns into a podcast, podcast.bretfisher.com. I'll put that in the links. Hello, everyone. We got Rhode Island. We got Istanbul, Netherlands, Virginia, North Carolina.
Ooh.
We got some people here.
Let's try to make it around the world. We gotta get some folks from each continent.
Don't get a lot of New Zealand's, but shout out to the people on the other side.
Yeah.
Not a good time for them to hang out, but every once in a while, maybe. All right, so hey, this is a podcast. You can go check it there. Hey, did you know we have a Discord server? It's right above me. You can go there and click on our server, the little Foxy logo, and chat with all the people. And we have events now, so you can click on the events. It's like your little DevOps calendar. You can go in there and see when we're happening now. You can see when we're happening again. You can see when we have the new Swarm fans meet up. And if you didn't know about our high fivers, it's like a little quiet 5 to 10 people usually just hanging out talking about DevOps like you were at the water cooler at lunch at work. And that's only if you're a high fiver member. So you do have to sign up. That's $5 American a month to join that little group. It's really just a quality filter to make sure you're there seriously. Seriously? And we have a hangout.
Sometimes I show up.
And sometimes Nirmal's there.
Yeah. So you got to come hang out.
I'm usually there. Since I host it, I'm typically there. We also have a newsletter. So it's technically my newsletter, but we talk about this show. I just released this week's this morning. You can go to Bret.news. I own as many Bret domains as I can afford. And we talked about, like, this is the show that you can watch right now. If I clicked it, we'd be watching ourselves, and that would be meta. We also had a podcast release this week. This was a couple of weeks ago. Actually, no, this was a couple of months ago. Our podcast is about 6 weeks or so behind the live show, so you can get that on all places podcasts exist, as far as I know. I try to make it available in every player. And something that we'll talk about real quick in a little bit is my talk from CIVO Navigate came out.
Yeah. The podcast being a little bit behind, it's like a recap. You can go and check out the podcast, get a little summary of what we've talked about. Sometimes you're not in front of a screen and you just want to listen to our lovely voices talk about all kinds of cloud native topics. So if it's that commute, if it's that those chores you have to do at home, just put those AirPods in and listen to the podcast.
I do it while chores. I listen to podcasts with chores. Since I don't have a commute anymore, I can't listen while driving to work.
You listen to podcasts in the 10-second, up and down the stairs to the office.
Yeah, put it in the lawn. Yeah, washing the dishes for lunch. You name it. I don't have a lawn to mow anymore either, so it's all mulch and dirt. So I can't. I mean, back in the day, let's go back a second to 1990. I would put in a tape deck. I had the little Sony Walkman. I probably didn't have the Sony Walkman. I probably had the knockoff brand. The Maxwell tape. And I would listen to tunes on my headset while mowing the lawn when I was a high schooler. But those days are long gone.
What's a tape, Bret?
What's a tape? There are so many good. I actually saw a band recently. There's a band, Moxie the Band is actually the name of the band, and they were doing effects by recording their stuff onto a tape and then pulling the tape out of the cassette and running it around like the table, and they would slow it down with their fingers, and it would like create like little effects on their music. Anyway, it was like, oh, that's neat. They're using old tapes. They were basically destroying tapes. Of course, when we were kids, no, don't. That's it. I need an extra tape. Don't do that. Especially those nice ones.
Yeah,
like the metal tape. Anyway, we're old.
In terms of announcements,
old stuff.
There's another big one. What's in terms of like events going on?
There's a little thing.
Are you ready for the drum roll and the cymbal crash?
Well, I don't have the drum roll. I have the bottom. Which is not appropriate. That does not work.
Dockercon is back.
But Dockercon.
In person.
So if you're on Docker's marketing lists, you probably got an email this morning that registration is now finally open. So it's in October in LA. Sorry, I watched the show Letterkenny, and that's how they say LA. Canadian show.
Register now.
I have not done this. but I will be registering. I hope we'll be talking. So Nirmal and I did a talk or submitted a talk. We'll see.
I'm
We'll
hoping
see if it
we're.
happens.
I hope it gets accepted.
That would be
It'll be a lot of
wonderful.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't done a talk together, so this will be a new fun thing that we can do. And
So if our talk gets accepted, you out there should register for Dockercon so you can see Bret and I live in person, in the flesh, in Los Angeles. And you can ask us questions in the infamous or the famous hallway track as well. One of my favorite things from DockerCons in the past.
yep,
Bret and I have spent many a good time in the hallway track. Can you tell us what hallway tracks are, Bret?
it's when you don't do enough talks at the conference, or you're denied a talk at the conference, so you make one in the hallway. um, so hallway tracks really, I mean, it's one of those things where it could be any time more than two people get together in the hallway and start chatting about things they just learned or things they're looking forward to learning. That could be a hallway track. There are more official things in the hallway track where they have a little area. There's a little area of the conference where you can actually reserve spots, and there's a whole app in the past where you could see people's topics and then you could choose to go. That was a part of hallway track too, right? Or did it have a different name?
Yeah, there were kind of like it was a little bit more structure. It reminds so hallway track. So one of the best parts of in-person conferences is that camaraderie and bumping into people in the community in the hallways of a conference. And that's one of the special parts of being together at something like DockerCon. And the awesome folks that organized DockerCons in the past realized that those special moments, that interaction in the hallways, in between sessions, uh, was where a lot of magic happened in terms of collaboration and in terms of strengthening community and breaking down those barriers in terms of folks meeting each other. And DockerCon has they kind of turned it into this thing called the hallway track, and it's a little bit more structured than, let's say, like a DevOps Days open spaces, but just a little bit more. There's some topics considered, but most of the time it's a free form kind of topic, and the right people that are there, and it's the topics du jour,
Yeah.
and it's people helping people. Yeah.
Yeah, sadly, it's we don't know about Europe yet. They have they the last I heard, it was not that they're not going to do Europe. They're just doing this one first, and then they're going to figure that out. Yeah, and in fact, Swarm was mentioned. Swarm talk at DockerCon. I'm not doing a Swarm talk, but that is certainly a hallway track option. So I don't know if they're bringing back all of those features, but if they have that same app experience where we can submit ideas, and then if you get enough people that say they're coming to your idea, you technically get like a little reserved spot in the corner. We did that for multiple years on Swarm at DockerCon because people were deploying Swarm and wanted to talk with other people but couldn't find them. We can do that. We technically have that online now. So like I just showed in our Discord server under events, you can now join. We're doing a bi-monthly, or sorry,
Swarm fans.
bi-monthly, not semi-monthly, bi-monthly, every other month Swarm fans meet up online for free. So if you're interested, go right there above us, DevOps fan, and you can sign up for Swarm. But we could do that in the real world. We could do a thing at the hallway tracks, and if we get all of our shit together, Nirmal and I will hopefully do a live stream from there. Like we're going to be there on a Thursday, so
If you'd like to see a live stream of Bret and I, put that in the notes and registering at DockerCon or something. I don't know if there's a special request, but
yeah, they're going to do a live stream, and wouldn't it be cool if we could somehow link up with them and do something together? So
yeah.
I'm trying to do that. I'm secretly on the side trying to figure out how can we be a part of that. We could do it would be this live show within the live stream. Like
there we go. We could do a live stream from the hallway track.
Yes.
All right, so we're here to
Dockercon.
answer cloud native questions. Do we have any yet?
We don't.
Have you looked at the framework laptops, Brett?
I don't know about them. I'm seeing that, yeah, Martin's buying one. Busy setting up a new machine, got one of them framework laptops. I do not know what that is.
All right, so if you want to pull up, I think it's frame.work. These are upgradable, modular. Oh, there we go.
Fire alarm test.
Laptops. These are upgradable, expandable, good for Linux laptops. And they're pretty neat.
Wow.
I would love to see how folks like what their take is on it and how they're liking them. But something to consider for that next laptop upgrade. Try something different.
Yeah.
So let us know. Come back after you get your machine set up. Come back on the show sometime in the next month's Q&A and let us know how your new framework laptop's running and how Docker is on there. Yeah.
Has this been done before?
You probably saw these at like different open source conferences. They've had booths, and I think there's some other brands as well. But
yeah. Okay, yeah, main board kit. So the main board kit has a defined area of the laptop, and you can swap it out. Wow.
Yeah. So we're still waiting for some questions here. Can you tell me more about Compose, Docker Compose Sync, Brett?
Yeah. So it's my favorite. It's so far is my favorite Docker thing of 2023.
Wow.
Docker has released 2 major versions this year, which is, I don't think they've ever done that, of the engine in the CLI. Not a ton of new features from a typical user's perspective, right? Like Docker run is still the same. Docker build is mostly the same. Once we start getting into build kit and front ends and stuff like that, there are definitely changes happening there. But the rest of us, we're all still using Compose for local development, maybe even on servers with Swarm. Docker a couple of years ago released Compose v2. So you're using v2 when you put Docker space Compose instead of Docker dash Compose. And I talked about that nonstop. I had multiple videos, entire shows dedicated to the new Compose v2. We had Docker on the show about Compose v2. And then quietly this year, they released the watch command, which as an alpha, it's an alpha feature, not even beta. And I like the idea of calling it Docker Compose Sync, like just even though I know that if we call something a feature and then we have the command as a different name, like it's just not going to work. I know that we'll all end up with the confusion.
Yeah, confusion. Yep.
But the command is watch. I like calling it Docker Compose Sync, or just Compose Sync. I think that's a great name for a feature set. And this, to me, solves an entire range of problems that we've had a host of other tooling out there try to solve. Like we've had other third-party community projects, people trying to solve the problem of if I bind mount my Docker on Mac, mostly on Mac nowadays, because Windows you can do it all in the Linux VM and solve some of the performance problems. But there's an inherent performance limitation if you've got thousands or hundreds of thousands of files in that bind mount, like your node modules or any dependencies or anything like that. So a lot of us, including even my own Node.js, I'm going to pick on Node.js because that's the one that's sometimes the worst. It's not PHP has this problem, Ruby has this problem, a lot of other package manager systems have this problem, but Node is well known as a challenge when you have large projects, many different dependencies in your Node modules, and then it's trying to install them, and you do like an npm install or npm upgrade. So it has to look at what's there over the bind mount, which is crossing the OS boundary, which is inherently hard to do, even if you have a local SSD and it's all there. Going from the Mac file system into the Linux file system, or even worse, from the Windows file system into the Linux file system, that sucks. It always isn't great on small demo projects and on the smallest projects out there. You don't notice it, not a problem. But on really large projects, Docker has
real projects.
on real projects, especially if you're someone who's as a team that has been using Node for years, and you have what I would maybe call a monolith Node app, where it's just got dozens of dependencies, if not more than dozens. You have a real problem there. And then, of course, all your code itself, the thousands of files that you might have if you have a large team project in Node. If you're doing a website where you're having static assets that have to be generated every time you hit the build key, or whatever, and it has to build out the front end of the website, like that's a lot too. That can be really slow in performance, and people don't like to wait 30 seconds or a minute every time they make a change or want to make a new build. So I don't blame them. So that's the problem, is bind mounts. We've had all these workarounds over the years. Like in my own examples, I use a volume trick where you essentially put your node modules in a volume and you keep your source code local, but you trick the node modules into going into a volume which doesn't cross the OS boundary. So that helps. And there's all these weird little effects. So then you have to design your Docker file differently. Yeah.
But you have to remember that kills a certain amount of the reproducibility of your dev environment to your production environment, right? So there's some trade-off there.
Yeah.
And you have to remember that these tricks exist within your configuration files.
You have to know about them. Like first you have to figure out, it's one of those things where, if you've heard in the performance space, I love this quote, is you don't have a performance problem until you have a performance problem. So like no one learns about these tricks usually until they have the problem and they're like, man, this is really slow. They search Stack Overflow, they find all these workarounds, they find specific third-party tools to augment or replace Compose for this problem. And then Docker comes out with a built-in feature called Docker Sync or Docker Watch, whatever one we want to call it. And that is, to me, the game changer. So it's like Mutagen does this. There's a Docker Sync third-party tool that's been around for years that does this. They all do it outside of the Docker command itself. And so this is now something that you can do after Docker Compose up. And they're sort of showing a couple of things it looks like. But you change the Compose file with this new xdevelop option. And you tell it multiple directories in the container that you want to match to a host directory. And this can cross the OS boundary, so between Mac and Linux or Windows and Linux file systems. And you can tell it if something changes on the host, what to do. Do you sync the file in automatically, just basically it's like a Docker CP, a Docker copy? Or does it rebuild the entire image because of that? That would be something like if you added a node module and you're depending on the node modules from the image, you might need to rebuild rather than just sync some files. If you change a source code file on your host system, you might just want to sync it in or copy it in instead of rebuild the image. So you can control all of that. They continue to add more little features. This is a pretty early blog post from early this year, so there's now more happening in this space. But the command after you do the up is this Docker Compose alpha watch command. And if you all have Docker Desktop now and you're on the current versions or recent versions, you have this feature. You just have to type Docker Compose alpha watch. I think it's a game changer. I think it doesn't solve all problems. Some people want to copy stuff back out of the container when it changes in the container. It does not do two-way file sync. It's just a one-way. Not that two-way is not possible, but it's definitely a harder and different problem because now you have to have something watching in the container itself, and Docker doesn't really have that ability, and Compose doesn't really have that ability built in to see inside a container's file system. So it's almost like there would need to be a second part that's kind of like running. We don't have sidecars in Docker, but running on the side or running as a Docker exec in there, or something that's watching inside that can then somehow notify the outside. I don't know. That would be kind of, I think it would be hard to do, but I'm not the smart one. So there's probably already people thinking.
So this is about really making the development loop more smooth, have less friction, right? Making a more frictionless development loop, right? So you have to specify what files are triggering those specific actions. So that's up to you to know, depending on what your workflow is with respect to this, development environment that you're working on.
Yeah.
But those are bespoke to the types of applications you're working on, or what component of your application you're working on. But you can specify that, right? You can switch to like a different xdevelop or a different watch, and then you have to run the watch command. And then the combination of those two things trigger this feature, essentially.
Yeah, and you can do it on multiple Compose services. So you can have multiple containers running where you've got this set up for each one of them. And it works. So it works. It's agnostic in terms of language support, package manager support. One of the challenges with everything we had before this was your solution usually was custom to your setup. So it was going to be custom to whether you got a third-party tool, or whether you needed a third-party tool, or how you sort of rigged up your Compose with Dockerfile scenario was all, and some of us didn't have to worry about this, because some of us, myself sometimes included, not always, but sometimes we're using remote development in the container through VS Code or another tool. That was, again, one of those ways of working out around this problem of bind mounts. And that problem, if you just kept everything in the container, you would be okay. And then maybe you rely on the editor to solve some of those problems. But then that's an editor-specific solution, so it doesn't work for everyone. So the fun thing here is if you're a Compose shop, and a lot of teams I work with even though they've Kubernetes in production, they are still Compose local. And this feature to me just adds it reduces complexity in all ways. I feel like it reduces complexity. It allows the team, you don't have to do the watch command, right? So you could have this Compose file with it all filled out, and if someone wants to develop locally with the old way, you can use override files, which have been a thing in Compose for years, where you can customize the team's Compose file with your own override. That changes it. So you can either add this support now, and even if your team doesn't want to change the Compose file, you can use an override to do this. Or you can also use an override to change it back to the old way if your team is trying to force this on you. So we've also, if you look at the Compose releases this year, there are multiple other new features. We've just landed a new feature around depends on required settings. So I have been a big fan of depends on for years, trying to advocate to people that it now works everywhere. It used to be where depends on didn't work the way we thought or the way we expected. It had to do with older Compose versions of the file format. That's all fixed, as long as you're not using Swarm. Swarm is still kind of lagging behind in the Compose file format support. So maybe someday someone will update the Swarm API to support the new modern Compose file that doesn't even require a version. But that's not here yet. What we are both talking about right now is just local Compose on your machine for development, not for deploying to Swarm stacks or anything like that. We're really just talking about development. And that's the thing I love to see about Docker is continuing to make it simpler, continuing to make it easier for local developers to use containers without added complexity. And I was recently I don't know if it was you that I was talking with, but someone recently I was talking with about, imagine a day in the future where someone is going to be able to install and figure out Docker Desktop and use it in their app without needing a course to understand it. It might have been with a Docker employee. I don't remember. I'm not going to claim that that was what happened,
I
but
don't believe you had that conversation with me.
okay. So yeah, I mean, it's an advantage to me that you often need a course to understand all this stuff. Like I sell courses, but wouldn't it be nice if new people coming out of university, or just
Yeah.
now finally doing containers, or coming into tech for the first time, and they really only need like a 5-minute explanation, and then they can figure it out the rest of the way, because all the edge cases are covered. It's so transparent to all the tooling. VS Code just picks up on it and says, "Hey, you're using Docker. Let me do this." Like VS Code already does that. All the editors are I don't. It's hard for me to think of a GUI editor that doesn't have some sort of Docker awareness
Like
to it.
understanding. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like integration. True. But that being said, you still like talking about these boundaries between the file system. That's still, it's not even edge case. It's just a case. Like you have to figure that out and figure out how you want to interact with your development containers. We have some questions.
Oh, right.
We have at least one. um, I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation. NCK, maybe.
Ooh, I say unsecure, but I don't know
Unsecure.
that I'm right.
Um,
It's Martin.
so,
He
so the
helps.
question.
He runs the Swarm fans group.
Oh, there we go. There we go. So maybe this will be more of a two-way conversation with respect to the question asked, which is, um, they are working on a Prometheus exporter to debug Swarm DNS lookups. Any idea of what to check on the network level in a Docker Swarm besides that? We had DNS lookup failures every once in a while, but I guess monitoring more is better. So, first of all, what are you using for DNS with respect to your Swarm?
Yeah, I think
And
it's
what
the
are you
built-in.
monitoring with respect to your DNS? So things to look for in terms of DNS metrics: request duration, seconds. So the total amount of time it takes for your DNS to um, to respond to a request. The response count by response code. So this is likely the main metric that you want with respect to the DNS lookup failures, because if you want to, there's different DNS response codes, R codes, and you want to count. You want to do a total count of how many. You want to do a count of the different types of R codes you're getting from your DNS, right? So if it's successful codes like OKs, sorry, I don't have all the DNS response codes memorized, but you can get a metric on that or create one. You want to know how many total DNS responses your system is responding to. Maybe it's just getting overwhelmed. Maybe your DNS resolver is getting overwhelmed with requests, and that will show up in the duration seconds. And if you have a total count that's going up for some reason, maybe there's a service that is not caching the results properly of a DNS lookup, or something else is going on with respect to that. So those are some of the areas. You want to look up response totals by different request types. So like NX domain, other types of records. Are
I
you
think
running
this.
any kind of DNS cache
I think this is
system?
related to a conversation in the Swarm channel on our Discord
Okay.
server, actually. Um, and Martin, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think this is a conversation around the Docker Swarms resolver. And this gets good. Honestly, this is a great conversation. It's one of those things where like the DNS in containers tends to be a little magic. I mean,
Mhm.
we're all we all get used to Docker run and Docker network create and then Docker compose up, and then it just works. And it's not like Docker is running a full DNS solution like a traditional Linux DNS server. It's running, back, I don't know, you and I were using Docker back in the day when Docker's DNS was updating host files in containers. Like that's the solution it had, was to just update anything else it adds to a container network. It just updates the host file in the container, and
Yep.
then those would resolve.
Super scalable solution.
So if you have 1,000 containers, it's got to update 1,000 host files every time you add a new container. Like that's the kind of problem that was. In fact, that actually reminds me of the new Kubernetes endpoint slice. Do you know about that?
Yes.
That problem was a scalability problem of too many nodes needed to know about all the endpoints for a service that was changed too many times because pods are rotating. So we came up with the idea of endpoint slice.
The endpoint slices are really neat because that enables like the topology aware routing, and you can start to do more complex routing in Kubernetes with load balancers and things like that. But pivoting back to DNS is
right.
I had a mentor early on in my career, and he told me it's always NTP, DNS, or certificates, or TLS. Like, that's the 3 areas of pain. And that advice has never failed me. So in general, monitoring your DNS is a good idea. It's often neglected. I think that's something that a lot of folks think is just there and it's working, but when it's not working well, it starts to affect everything. And I'm trying to see if I can get a list of the metrics. But if you're writing a Prometheus exporter for those DNS metrics, those are some of the ones I would look at. I know this is a link that's related to ECAS and core DNS, but it does list some metrics that are of an interest with respect to DNS in general. And so that might be a good place to start looking for some of the metrics to look at with respect to DNS in general. So the link I sent is related to core DNS, not the swarm, but DNS metrics should be pretty similar. Regardless of the system.
That's a good one. Yeah, I think the problem we're talking about is the trick on Swarm too is that since it's so much not like a normal DNS server, it uses a gossip protocol. This is how I understand that it works. I could be wrong. There's a gossip protocol between the servers that passes new DNS information between the nodes so that they can respond to things locally. That's how I think it understands. It's not like in Kubernetes, it's like there's a container that has to respond to your DNS requests, and that's not the same way in Swarm. So I think the original conversation was around a bugginess of certain things stop resolving at certain times. I have, over the years of using Swarm, I have had nodes also stop resolving names properly, and my solution is to destroy that node and replace it with a new one. Like I don't actually troubleshoot Swarm nodes. I just kill them and recreate them. So I'm always trying to design a solution where nodes, whether the physical VM nodes or whatever you're doing to provision nodes, that solution automatically creates the new node and automatically installs Docker and automatically adds it back to Swarm. At some point, I had a script, and it was simply a cloud init that went in AWS's launch groups. Is that what it's called? In EC2? Yep. Yeah. It was just a launch group that would automatically, if you killed a node, it would put one back in, it would provision it, add it back to the Swarm. And so, yes, the containers, like I would do a healthy Swarm drain, and then Swarm leave. And so it would be a nice, proper, I didn't just turn off the VM, but I just kill them, honestly. Like the node misbehaves, you're out, you're done. I'm not trying to troubleshoot you. Also, because I'm not that smart, so I don't know how to troubleshoot the Swarm node gossip protocol to figure out why is this Swarm node not responding to container DNS requests. I just didn't know, so I would kill it. Anyway, this is a good talk. You mentioned NTP, Network Time Protocol. Oh my goodness. I actually have a white paper. It's like the equivalent of a white paper I did as a blog post, and I think it was in 2004. That is probably still on my old blog. fishbrains.com, in case anybody's wondering what my old blog was. That because you're right, back in those days, like we take time for granted now. Every once in a while, someone comes up with a new time issue in containers because you do have to like get.
I mean, that happens. It still happens. It still happens.
But it's so much like having Windows machines on a Windows network in 2004 when there would be a Windows patch for a new DST change, and you had to make sure 7,000 computers got that patch so that when the DST changed for that zone in America or the world or somewhere for daylight savings, that the computers would properly respond to that thing. Like, those days are gone, but I ended up having to write a whole paper around, because like the time protocols can run on UDP and TCP, and there was like, and it's very similar to DNS, where like we now have DNS over HTTP. We have like so many different complexities around DNS that it's not the same simple little protocol. It runs on 53, if I remember correctly, like we did back in the day. Remember that when you had DNS requests that were too big and it would actually fail. It would move over to UDP, I think, for larger packets, and then if your firewall didn't allow it, it would deny. Look, I've got some battle scars. That's all I'm saying. I've got some battle scars.
Totally. That's the true, not the true, but that's one of the gauntlets that a lot of us older sysadmins have gone through is resolving, no pun intended, resolving DNS and NTP issues. My favorite video about time and computers is the Tom Scott video. I think it's on Computer File, which is a great YouTube channel. I just linked it in the chat, and it's time with respect to programming and computers is basically intractable. It is an impossible problem. All right. We have a question. By the way, I hope that helps with respect to the DNS questions. I would love for you to come back to another subsequent Q&A. Tell us what you discovered while writing this Prometheus node exporter for the DNS. Highly needed, I think, even outside of Docker Swarm. That's an area that gets really tricky at times. Dan Adu, I hope I'm saying that correctly. We want to pull up this question.
Before this question, I had to find it.
Oh, there it is. 2004.
That's 19 years ago. I have a post on my old website, which, if you're wondering, I mean, look at this guy's face. Like, can I zoom in on that? Who is that guy?
Wow.
So it's frozen in time. I stopped it. I don't know. It was like 7 or 8 years ago. I think I stopped using it. That's a picture of Hyper-V, because I was a hardcore Windows guy, as well as obviously Linux. You can tell I was running on a Mac. But yeah, I wrote an article, and it was like, it's so old that like even I think it wasn't even on the blog. It was probably on a different blog engine. So I have a bunch of like, these are supposed to be Windows CMD commands, Windows, not even called Windows console commands, regedits. These are old school things, but yeah, I'm sure that link doesn't work anymore. Windows 2000. I was making reference to a Windows 2000. Anyway, I've been a nerd a long time. I just wanted to point that out for historical purposes. You don't even have to use the Wayback Machine, because I've lived on the internet for 30 years, so I keep all my blogs alive, even if they're 25 years old. So
thank you for doing that.
I don't want the internet to degrade till nothing works, no links work. You have to,
totally
pay $5 a month for that website, and it has no purpose anymore. I don't know why I still have it, but
yeah. I like Rachel's comment. I do the same thing. No time to debug. Just kill it and start over fresh.
Yeah. I mean, I love that, right? Like
hashtag modern DevOps.
We don't know how things are broken. We didn't solve the problem. We just work around it.
All righty. Should we go to the next question?
Yes, question.
I'm converting Apache HTTP server and Pivotal TC server apps. I have 2 containers, an app server and an Apache HTTP server, but they run on the same box originally. Having trouble configuring in Docker. Okay. I have my app and running in Docker Compose, hard to describe in 200 characters. That's fair. Well, this is actually a great opportunity to go to the Discord DevOps fans, I think it's there.
There you go.
That provides more space for you to ask that question. Not that we're trying to punt on the question, but if you have some more detail, um, more than welcome to try to help debug or help answer it.
Yeah, Dan, I can't remember if you're in our Discord server. I mean, I know you're a regular on the show here. I'm trying to think if I missed this conversation. So yeah, try that as well. I mean, so the question really is the first thing I would ask you is how is Apache talking to your app, right? Is it using a socket? If so, it's going to be a little tricky to do that in Compose. You maybe could figure out a way where the socket between them is in a volume, and then it stays on the host OS, and they can both talk to the same volume, and one can read and one can write.
Mm-hmm. But
That's possible.
You might hit privileged container issues there, depending on like the file permit, like the socket permissions.
Yeah.
So you just have to be careful about that.
Yeah, when I used to do Apache plus like PHP mod, like mod PHP kind of stuff, the Apache or Nginx are expected to talk to PHP on the back end through a file socket or a network socket. File sockets are always faster. Well, they used to be faster. They didn't have to go through the TCP chain. So we would put it in a single container. You can still do that. It just gets more complicated, and we generally discourage you from doing that. So, like, I have an example that I could even point you to of a PHP using supervisor D as the main process in the container. Then it runs both services, and they use file sockets to talk to each other, pass stuff back and forth really quickly. You have less permissions issues that way because it is the same users. You have the same permissions because you control the user IDs of both because they're in the same container. It's a little easier. But other than that, it sounds like you're going to have to get into specifics, and that's exactly why we have the Discord server.
So the next question or the next statement you just wrote, Dan, if the containers are getting separate IPs, then they are likely in the normal network mode for containers, which means that so the way that Docker works is it's running a bridge network to the host's Ethernet port or network, if you will, and then it's running its own overlay network that has its own IP address range. Each container is going to get an IP address from that range, and then the typical way of container to container communication is you expose an open port in your container. The Docker gives each container an IP address. It opens that port. It does the routing and the natting and the bridging, all the network magic. And if it's within one Docker Compose stack or Compose file, then back to the DNS conversation, Docker's automatically going to create a DNS record with a specific syntax for each of those services. So in your application code or your HTTP server, you only have to reference the other container by that DNS name and connect to it over the port that you're exposing from that container. Let me see if I can hunt down the Docker networking overview. There we go. More information here. There's a lot of nuance. Networking is where things get kind of wonky with respect to containers. That's like where there's a lot of options and there's a lot of ways to do things. But the typical pattern, and Bret, you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but the typical pattern is to just expose the ports and reference one server by its service name and let Docker magic do its networking goodness. So I hope that helps. If you want to post in the Discord like some of your errors that you're getting or our configuration, feel free. For the Apache HTTP server, yeah. So typically, a typical, let's say, 3-tier web app or microservices app you have a load balancer or a web server that's that you're exposing, it's port 80 or 443 um, onto the main host interface, and then the container to container communication in the back end uh, is done over that overlay network. So it really just depends on the architecture. There's every permutation under the sun that you can do with respect to Docker container networking, but that's the typical way of exposing a service.
Good response, Dan. Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. It is very context specific. So, like, you're asking about best practices for Apache HTTP server. There really the HTTP image works out of the box in a container. Ideally, you're using that with your app. So your app is a custom container. HTTP, the Apache project, is its own custom. It's its own official container from the Docker Hub, and you don't have to modify that. And it keeps it. And your Apache, it sounds like your Apache is going to need to talk or pass information back to your app. I don't know, but there's a lot of information we need to do to help you with that. Apache in a container doesn't really operate that differently. What is different about Apache is if I've been using Apache since when we were using CGI, and stuff back in the 90s. So, we were putting Perl in Apache servers. So generally, one thing I see problem, and this is probably not related to him, is Nirmal and I probably have both seen this. We're all used to Apache servers are so advanced and they've been around for so long that back when we were all using like Bluehost and all these website hosters with what's the name of that? cPanel administrative interface, we would try to load up a bunch of different websites all in the same Apache web server. So you'd have like one Apache daemon, all these different config files, all these different websites. And generally now it's less efficient in terms of memory and CPU resources, but generally now you're talking about a one-to-one relationship. So one Apache container for one web app, and then another Apache container for another website or web app or whatever. So that's one of the big things. But other than that, I'm not sure I would know of a guide for Apache, because it all configures the same way. It's just a real question about how does Apache talk to your other app. And I'm glad to help. Ping me, by the way, with an @Bret Fisher in the DevOps fan server over there in Discord. Do that in the Docker channel, and I'm happy to continue the conversation there. That's a complex problem and a complex project, so it's hard to answer that on the channel. But I'm glad you reached out. I'm going to answer another question real quick. Rachel, while you were answering that one, I was working on the question. Next question. Rachel has a question about blue-green deployments, and is it recommended to do blue-green deployments with Terraform only? I didn't even know Terraform could do blue-green deployments. So I would say no. That sounds like that is an option for you. I have not known that was a thing to do with Terraform. Once things are on Kubernetes, or once you have a Kubernetes cluster, I tend to not use Terraform for things on top of that. I feel like there's better tools out there, things like Argo, Flux, other what we now call GitOps. I've liked those tools for doing things on top of Kubernetes, rather than relying on Terraform, which is I leave Terraform for the infrastructure, and then once the infrastructure is provisioned, meaning Kubernetes, my method is to do other tools on top of that. So let me give you some resources. On Kubernetes, there's a couple options you have. There's lots of options you have for blue-green deployment. But you typically in Kubernetes, there's two main things. One of the ways is to take your proxy provider or your ingress on Kubernetes and let them do that job, which is not this one. I pulled up the wrong one. If you looked at, for example, Traffic, if that was your ingress provider, I'm going to give you some links in chat. And the first one is Traffic. They support blue-green methodologies. If you're using something like Contour with Envoy, Contour also provides blue-green deployment. Basically, any ingress provider that I know of is going to support that. And then if you want something a little bit different, check out Argo rollouts. So the Argo project has 4 main sub-projects. I talk all the time about Argo CD, which is in fact the course that I'm giving live this week, all about Argo CD. We just had a big old workshop yesterday where everybody was learning about application sets, my new my favorite feature of Argo CD, which is relatively new.
So
Anyway,
all
we're not talking
details
about
of
that.
Argo are embedded in your mind right now, correct?
Yes, I am deep in Argo right now. We will end this chit chat. I will be going and doing more Argo stuff today. So,
Would you call yourself an Argonaut at this point?
sure, yes, of course. And Argonauts are a thing. Why not? Um, they have their own project called Rollouts, and I recommend you check that out as a potential solution as well. It tends to be well received. People tend to like it. I have unfortunately not used it in a real world setting, but they have videos. Yeah, so you have options. You have lots of options. I don't have any experience with doing it in Terraform, so I can't recommend or not recommend that method. It seems like it would not be as good as doing it in those other tools I just mentioned. And then I saw your text, your response of, I have a customer who's trying to do this with just Terraform, but I find it hacky. That would be my guess too, is that it does seem
it's not
like a one shot. Yeah.
The synchronization of the Kubernetes state. So Terraform works best when it owns the state of the system, but Kubernetes is like its own. Kubernetes owns the state of the Kubernetes system, so
Yeah.
you end up in this like contentious kind of environment where Terraform is not synchronized and doesn't know what the state of Kubernetes is while you're doing other things on Kubernetes, and it's very hard to manage Kubernetes resources with Terraform. So highly plus 1,000, what you just said, plus 100, what you said, right?
Right. Yeah, I think both of us are. I mean, my only experiences with Blue, Green, Canary, all those different things is through Kubernetes itself, like things I'm putting on Kubernetes controllers. Yeah, because the default rolling update strategy isn't always the best for advanced scenarios. So we all have to at some point figure out some other way to do it on top of that. But yeah, not. Yeah, I mean, I love Terraform. I use it all the time. I just don't think that that's a great place for it. But there's a great. So Kelsey Hightower, both of us are. I'm going to say, speak for you and say that we're both fans of this guy. Recently retired. I'm not sure really what that means, but he's retired from the cloud. I'm not sure what that exactly means for him, but good luck. I'm happy for him. And he would often say, don't try to boil the ocean with one tool, or don't try to take one tool and use it for everything. Just because Terraform can do all things, it can try to do all things. There are still some things Ansible is better at. There are still some things that tools on top of Kubernetes are better at. And we shouldn't expect it. I have a hard time with Terraform nowadays because I want it to do continuous monitoring of everything it's doing so that it can detect drift. And so it's not always the best tool for all these things. So I'm just going to quote Kelsey there and say, yeah, you might just need to add another tool to the tool set. And I know it's not your choice. I know it's your client. Like maybe convince them somehow. Convince them. Show them this show. Show them the clip of this show and say, look, that guy on the internet, he said to do it. Shungo, by the way, I see your question or your text. Thank you for buying the course, by the way. If you have questions in the course, please ask them either in the course Q&A, or if you go to that server over there, the devops.fan Discord server. You may know about Discord. Go into the devops.fan, and there are channels at the bottom for you to ask course questions. If you have installation questions, if you have problems with Docker, jump into the Discord server. It's over here. You scroll all the way to the bottom. It's free to join. Go down to course help, and you'll see for Docker Mastery right there. Look at that. And you can ask questions, and the community is awesome. I feel so blessed to be a part of a Discord server where people will take my course, show up in there with questions, and other people who have either taken, or I don't even know if they've all taken my courses or not, but they will try to help answer your questions. I'm very grateful for that. I don't expect people to do that, but they do it anyway, and it's kind of fantastic that people help out. So go check out Discord. Probably get the fast response there more so than in Udemy, but if you're in Udemy, you have the Q&A there. I check that every day, so you can get help there. Great question. All right. we are at the hour, so we're going to give a chance for one more question.
Oh, did we just get it? I'm
Uh,
required to SSH into an instance on AWS before I'm able to use VS Code Editor to create infrastructure using Terraform. Not necessarily. So you can run Terraform. You can run Terraform locally on whatever machine you want. You. Let me put it this way: the machine Terraform uses the credentials, your AWS credentials of wherever it's running. So if you have an AWS profile set up on your local machine, you have Terraform installed locally, you have your Terraform files, it will use those AWS credentials to go out to your AWS account and run. When you're doing a Terraform apply that infrastructure as code to your AWS account, you are not required to SSH into an EC2 instance or like a jump box. That being said, uh, follow the rules of whatever organization you're in. They might require you to be on a Bastion host or SSH into an EC2 instance to get the proper credentials for interacting with your AWS environment. So you're not required to, but follow your applicable local policies.
and
Great
with
question, though.
that,
Yeah,
I feel like that's the final answer for the day. We have
squandered
done
another
it.
good hour.
We have done it. We have put Nirmal through the gauntlet, and he has come out swinging with more answers. Yes, you can run Terraform from anywhere. I like using VS Code. It understands Terraform files. I run it locally and just give Terraform the key that it needs to get to the servers.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and it works great. I don't ever really need to. Now, granted, if you're doing stuff with Terraform on specific infrastructure that you don't have access to, yeah, you have to. You have to do it wherever you have the access, but you tend to be able to do that locally. Very great. I mean, look at this. Like we were talking about Kubernetes, we're talking about Docker, we're talking about Compose, we're talking about Terraform. We've covered all bases, all
DNS,
the realms of DevOps.
We're just missing TLS. Next time we got some TLS questions.
Oh, yes. We talked about network time protocol. We talked about DNS protocols. Yes, the next one is we're going to have to go way back. Maybe we'll talk about Telnet and IRC. And well, I'm going to leave that for next time. I'm about to go down a long road of old school technologies that don't even exist really. They're not used on the internet anymore, even though they still exist. But
so to our audience, if you like Bret and myself answering your cloud native questions, tell your friends, tell your family, come to the next time. When's the next cloud native Q&A show? A month from now?
Yeah. So we do this every month, you and I. So next week there'll be a guest. Let's look at that list. Next week we have a guest. And let's see, let me bring it up.
So you have 1 month to come up with your questions.
We have a calendar for this, and I don't. I need to get the link. I don't have the link readily available, and I need to start doing that. But we have a calendar in case you want to put it on your own calendar. I'll get that fixed.
So the next show is Dan Garfield from CodeFresh.
Yeah. So next week, CodeFresh. We're going to talk about CodeFresh is a big supporter of Argo CD. Hence, we just talked about that. Argo. They're going to be on the show next week. Dan, the co-founder's here. Met him years ago. Actually, I met him in LA when you and I were at. I think it was LA when we were at the Linux Foundation Open Source Summit in 2017. Great guy. After that we have a course Q&A. So I alternate, right? That's what we do on this format. Is every other week is a guest, and then once a month it's just the two of us answering your questions, and then once a month I don't know why I do this to myself, but I answer all the questions. That is August 3rd. So in 2 weeks there's that. Then we're going to have Garden.io, another CI provider out there that has some stuff they want to talk about. I am interested in learning a little bit about Garden because I haven't yet had to use it, but I want to know more about it. So they're going to be on the show. We've got Josh from Ufizzy, which is ephemeral environments, preview environments. I teach that actually in my GitHub Actions course. I actually show off their little tool. It's basically with GitHub Actions, it's a really easy way to spin up entire environments and then tear them down with every PR. It's pretty cool. We got Ken coming on for Lambdas in September, talking about containers and Lambda on AWS. He's an AWS serverless hero. And Multipass, which is a way to run super easy Linux VMs. It's my favorite way to run local VMs on Ubuntu. It does more than Ubuntu, but mostly everyone uses it for Ubuntu. And yeah, and then you get Nirmal almost every week there, like more Nirmal all the time.
Alrighty, so it looks like you have till August 17th to come up with some more questions. So looking forward to the next time, Bret.
Yes, and I have a big question for the audience if they're still here. Would you listen to this thing that we just did? Would you listen to that in a podcast? If we simply just put that in a raw podcast, no editing, you get to hear all my ums and stutters. Would that be valuable in podcast form, in audio only for when you're taking your walk with a dog or whatever and you need to listen to a podcast? However you listen to your podcast. I don't need to tell you when to listen to podcasts. So that's the big question for today is, would this be listened to in a podcast form? And with that, by the way, just a reminder, it is a podcast. You can go to bretfisher.com over there on that side. bretfisher.com. You can get the podcast on my site. You can listen to all our back episodes, hundreds of episodes now of this live show. And with that, we will see you next week here with Code Fresh. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.